Okay, well, it is right at the top of the hour. Looks like we've got a nice crowd showing up this afternoon, so I'm going to go ahead and kick things off, get us started for our webinar today that's going to discuss SharePoint best practices in the context of lessons learned and some things that we see on a regular basis. A couple of points about this webinar. First, we will appreciate any feedback y'all can provide. This is the first of its kind for us in terms of trying to do in a discussion type format where there'll be a moderator and a subject matter expert in the conversation back and forth. So it'd be good to get some feedback on that as we think about doing more of these in the future. Second, this is a 30-minute webinar, so this is not going to be exhaustive nor super detailed on many of these lessons learned, but really a survey of the things that we see, and I suspect many of the people on the call see, and some conversations around on ways that might help avert some of the challenges associated with SharePoint implementations and Microsoft 365 implementations based on what we've seen and heard in the past. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and dig right in so we can use our time wisely here and talk about some introductions very quickly. So on the call today, this is David Quackenbush. I'm Vice Chairman of GIML, and with us as our subject matter expert for the discussion is Will Irwin, one of our product managers. I apologize for the stumbling. For some reasons, these allergies seem to be cropping up at the wrong time for the spring pollen flow. But anyway, we're going to be in a back and forth type of discussion for today's webinar. So a couple of points about the webinar. If you have questions, we want this to be interactive from the audience as well. So if there are questions that come up, feel free to submit them through the question icon in the webinar for the Zoom meeting. We are going to record this, so we'll be out. We'll send this out to all the people that registered, and you'll be able to follow it there. And if there's any challenges with Zoom, what have you, please let us know so we can make sure we solve that problem for you during the webinar. So today's agenda looks something like this. First, we'll do a quick cover on confirming what everyone already kind of understands is why SharePoint is so hard and why there are so many challenges, and why when we work with clients, we often encounter challenges that begin with overlooking certain things that would have made their SharePoint implementation more effective, more usable, and ultimately get higher adoption from the get-go when new solutions are deployed. Probably one of the biggest biggest things that we hear from clients is how many times they've kind of had a bad start or a bad implementation of SharePoint. And I think what we'll talk about today is that that's an effect more of how things were done as opposed to limitations with SharePoint in and of itself as a platform. It's actually a very powerful platform. We'll do a little bit of a discussion on best practices here, and this is really where we'll get more into the body of our webinar and the back and forth between Will and myself, going over some of the key questions and points about making SharePoint really hum and work well. And then if there's time, answer any additional questions that y'all may have on the webinar. A quick update on GIML. I think most people that have registered probably are familiar with us, but GIML is an information governance and records management software company. Our focus is really to help our clients strike a nice balance between the value that quality information can provide the organization, and the risk it presents when perhaps not managed properly or not managed in a way that where compliance is a point of importance. Gimel goes to market today with 5 core products that really cover the gamut of information governance and records management, period. We have Gimel Migrate, Gimel Discover, Gimel Link, Gimel Records, and Gimel Physical, each one with its own specific set of capabilities around helping manage the life cycle of content in the organization and moving it towards a more Microsoft-centric, in many cases, environment, which is what we see with the vast majority of our clients. So let's talk about why SharePoint is so hard and what are the common themes that come up with SharePoint implementations in Microsoft 365. And I'm gonna use SharePoint as a generic term here, not to try to distinguish between on-premise and Microsoft 365 SharePoint Online challenges, but really as a kind of a generic set of challenges and opportunities for improving the SharePoint experience. First and foremost, SharePoint sprawl. Probably the number one thing we get is before I know it, I've got thousands of SharePoint sites. Most are not connected to each other. Most have been developed in some kind of bespoke manner, either via lack of sheer governance across the enterprise, and so departmental SharePoint administrators are building sites to solve particular problems for that particular department, or perhaps worse, over generations of SharePoint use that might have began in the SharePoint 2007 days, a multitude of sites and maybe even still running multiple versions of SharePoint, all not integrated for any particular set of use cases. And it's too easy. In some cases, it's too easy to get started. That really created some of that, right? I used to think about, people would tell us that SharePoint just showed up and people started creating sites with SharePoint. There wasn't really a strategy for SharePoint in a lot of cases in most organizations when it got started. It just ended up there and in a very organic way gained adoption in the enterprise because people saw how easy it was to create a few SharePoint sites and do collaboration, maybe manage projects, or a variety of other activities that it became very useful for. Consistency and control is a real challenge with SharePoint because of the 2 above points. How do I build a model, and usually once I get started and I don't have that model, can I ever rein it back in and get consistency and control where all my site information architecture looks good, all my metadata is consistent, whether I'm using the term store or some other method to consistently deploy metadata into SharePoint sites, the consistent use of content types, the consistent use of structuring. Am I going to use folders or am I not going to use folders? And there's just, a myriad of choices there that the more consistency and control, the more likely it is you're going to have a more adoptable environment. SharePoint tends to look like an island unto itself sometimes. It's a platform, it's an application, it's lots of different things. It can be integrated with lots of other systems, but in and of itself is an application platform itself, and therefore has plenty of capability to do a variety of different things without necessarily having to be integrated with any other systems in the enterprise in order to make that happen. Subsequently, we often see the Swiss Army knife nature of SharePoint is for many organizations, once you start to make that investment, you go, well, let's use SharePoint for this, or we'll use SharePoint for that, and it becomes the Swiss Army knife of multiple solutions in the organization. So once that starts to happen, you know, how do I really look at that from a governance perspective and say, well, great, I can do lots of different things with it, but I've got to figure out a way to rein it in a little bit, or it's going to make my situation worse, not better. And last but not least, perhaps our favorite is that it's always changing. So you don't have a consistent platform from which to build upon, because Microsoft has gone through so many generations of SharePoint and really improved it and strengthened it, that from environment to environment, from version to version, from on-prem to in the cloud, the changes are significant and meaningful. And so keeping up with all those changes, number one, and number two, applying a lot of the new capabilities are important things that make SharePoint challenging when you think about all the different options you have available to you. So now we're going to hop into, with that backdrop, we're going to hop into the discussion part of this, and I'm going to bring Will into the conversation. I don't know if you have any other things you want to say about the previous slide, Will, before we jump into talking about best practices, but I'll give you the floor for a sec if you had anything to add to that first list.
Yeah, no, thanks, Quack. I think you hit all the main points on that last slide, but for this slide here, really the main points that I wanted to call out here is really the information architecture and classify and govern piece. These are two things that that organizations should do, but sometimes resist doing because they can be challenging. And without diving too deep into it, information architecture is pretty much about organizing things effectively, right? And in relation to SharePoint, this is understanding really the framework that defines your sites, metadata, taxonomy, and your content types. It's really enable the effective implementation of content governance and support for the end user. So what we're saying here is information architecture really helps you organize all the important information in your organization so you can more easily store it, find it, use and control that information. And the next point here that I wanted to key in on is classifying and governing content uploaded or created in SharePoint. That's really the next step and the result of good information architecture. However, enforcing information governance, like tagging content with the appropriate metadata values, it can be challenging, especially if left up to the end user's discretion, right? And SharePoint out of the box has some capability of accomplishing this, but Gimel also provides products like Gimel Records and drop zones that really help alleviate these issues. And I highly recommend focusing on those two concepts in particular, because this is really the foundation that good SharePoint implementation is built on, which really helps accomplish an organization's goals of having high availability, high quality information with high adoption from the end users. I'll put it back to you, Quack.
Great, excellent. So appreciate that, Will. So it's interesting, and we ought to dig into a couple of those points a little bit more. I wanted to provide a little bit more context for what everybody's looking at here. In our view, the goal of using any system, implementing any new system, is really high availability and high quality information. And how do I get there? And how do I overcome the mistakes of the past when it comes to managing content and documents in a way that really support that goal? And ultimately, how do I build a system or implement a system that's so easy to use that I really get high adoption? And by easy to use, not just, hey, it's easy to see what my options are with my menuing and navigation and things like that, but actually information architecture that draws people in and is compelling, that really focuses on adoption. So the two pictures here are really meant to indicate just that there's a lot involved here, that SharePoint best practice isn't just about how to work with the tool. It still involves all the things you'd expect around building best practice around people, process, and technology, from governance, from understanding how to use and leverage the new capabilities always of the product, templatizing and standardizing your deployment, and then also having strong knowledge and change management capability built into the model. But over to the right, it's also about doing all the standard stuff that you would expect to want to do when you're implementing any kind of new system, doing the upfront analysis and make sure that it's thorough, trying to simplify business process wherever possible. The tendency is to overcomplicate these things in particular, and so really simplification becomes a key objective, and then again applying innovation where you can. So really understanding where I can start to leverage new capabilities in SharePoint and Microsoft 365 to improve process. And a great example of that is Teams. So Microsoft Teams is a great example of how people very quickly, because of COVID, shifted from SharePoint site conversations to Teams conversations, even though under the covers, much of the content, or almost all the content managed in Teams, is embedded in SharePoint sites. That change became significant, and today you hear more people talking about deploying Teams for X, Y, and Z than you hear about deploying SharePoint for X, Y, and Z. So some important concepts here from a best practice perspective. On the classification front, I got a couple of other questions for you that thought it might be worth going into. What's your perspective on how organizations should think about classification today when they're setting up new SharePoint environments and the use of content types and managed metadata and the like?
Yeah, sure. So whenever I think of classification, the two main pieces that I try and accomplish is, okay, if the end user, the people who are the content creators, the people using that content, if they can search and find and use that content, then that checks a box. And if classification also satisfies any organization's retention or disposition policies, then you're good. I try and get the minimum amount so I can satisfy those two goals, and really anything else is kind of a nice to have, depending on the user experience. And really too much information, it could be borderline information overload, to where it could deter people from even using SharePoint if they have to manually enter in too many metadata values and things like that.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. It's the less is more concept is very powerful. Have any thoughts on some of the newer capabilities from auto classification standpoint, like syntax, and how that combined with a smart approach to classification or simplified classification really accelerates the ability to not only capture information more easily, but keep the consistency high?
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up, Quack. So one of my favorite things that Microsoft is coming out with, or has come out with, that's relatively new here, is called SharePoint Syntax, which captures that user expertise through really the use of this no-code machine learning. So users can actually teach this artificial intelligence model to go out and read the content and recognize critical pieces of information. And once this model is trained to kind of read and understand that content, Syntax then extracts that information and applies the values to the appropriate metadata columns that you have, which really makes it that much easier for users to tackle the task of tagging those metadata values.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. That's it's an interesting point. Syntax is pretty new. It's been talked about some, and like all the new AI and machine learning based approaches, I think this is going to be one of those that it's worth taking look at and playing around with as it becomes more and more powerful. I think Microsoft's just at the beginning of this. We're not really here to promote the Microsoft story, but this is one particular area where Microsoft innovation is something that we've seen as can be a real game changer for a lot of organizations that just have a disaster on their hands as it relates to not only dealing with the way you handle new content, but how you try to deal with the pile of existing content that can get remediated through something like a syntax model and classifier to perhaps bring some better control over that content as well, without going through a massive transformation exercise, which is not only time consuming, but pretty costly from a resource perspective. So this is something pretty important going forward. We're gonna hop into a couple of other quick topics here that we mentioned at the beginning, and then we're gonna try to get to some questions. I see I've got a question popping up here already. So I'm going to, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna address these questions near the end and try to tie in all the things that we've discussed here in the session. So SharePoint sprawl. This is one that continues to be a head scratcher for many organizations. And I think the key question is balancing the control and desire of the end user communities of whatever form they are, whether they're project team sites or whether they're controlled information sites or departmental sites or communication sites. How do I support the ability for the fringes of the organization to be able to create a lot of this content on their own, these sites on their own, without having to do everything through IT, and balance that against SharePoint sprawl? So what do you think about this, Will? You know, one of the questions I have written down here is that we still seem to be dealing with sprawl. What do you see are some of the biggest causes that you've run into that's driven sprawl, and how does it affect, how have you seen it affect the ability for clients to say, hey, I can get high adoption out of a SharePoint environment?
Yeah, sure, Quack. I might reiterate some of the points that you just made, but yeah, like we mentioned before, the SharePoint sprawl is a very real issue for most organizations using SharePoint, and like Quack was saying, if left ungoverned, you can have a needless amount of stale SharePoint sites, and content can really exist in the environment, making it difficult to know what's real or current or important, and also makes it hard to know what you even have to begin with. And really this causes frustration on the end users as they have trouble finding what they need, and it can also lead to some pretty serious e-discovery risks if left unmanaged. And really the best way to reduce SharePoint sprawl is to plan and implement good information governance. Really, an organization should develop and utilize an enterprise taxonomy to properly tag and classify their content, and users should be trained on this process and really understand the solution. But even with the proper initial planning and training, organizations will still encounter sprawling content because things change, right? Organizations restructure, or business processes are revised, or maybe new content is created that may not have been planned for initially, and may not have a home or have the metadata available for classification. SharePoint and taxonomy change processes should be outlined and really understood, so that when a new site is needed, or if a new metadata column is required, that it's done so the right way and really made aware to everyone. And again, this doesn't have to be overly complicated, and really you should use the the simplest, most straightforward approach. But something like this is really necessary to ensure that SharePoint sprawl is kept at a minimum.
Yeah, agreed. So here's a good one to talk about real quick as we're winding down on time. What is your opinion? We get a lot of questions when you talk about taxonomy, when you talk about classification, and big words. But one of the more common questions that we get is folder structures versus content types versus a blend. Any thoughts on what you think is a good approach to take here from organizing content and making it easy to not only find a home, but also consistently apply metadata?
Absolutely. And this is a question we get asked all the time, and the one that we do have a recommendation for, and really creating your enterprise taxonomy in SharePoint through the use of content types and metadata. This is extremely important. I can't harp on this enough. This is honestly how you realize the true value of SharePoint right here. Gimel recommends against recreating any kind of file share, folder structure, or hierarchy in SharePoint. This is a mistake that I've seen many organizations make, and once implemented, it's sometimes tough to rectify. And I know it's much easier to conceptualize the folder structure concept for organizing content, because we've all done that for years, but resisting the use of content types and metadata, it will lead to failure. And without this taxonomy, users have trouble finding and using the information. I know I've said that before. And organizations will also not be able to effectively implement content governance without utilizing these taxonomy elements. And really, like I said before, really the recommended approach is to determine the minimum amount of metadata needed for findability and usability on the end user end, as well as any minimum requirements needed for governance or records management purposes. And even with some of the new artificial intelligence moves that Microsoft is making, this metadata is still at the core of those solutions, and really it's here to stay.
Agreed. That's great. Thank you. We have time for one more of our topical areas, but as it turns out, this one to me is sort of at the top of the list, because what we get so many times are the stories of failed SharePoint implementations, and I think the chorus line to the chorus as well. We didn't do this or we didn't do that. But a couple of things happened in that we didn't do this and we didn't do that. And these are kind of apple pie and type of suggestions. One is that the business was never really involved in the establishment of the information architecture. So you mentioned this earlier, but I thought it might be worthwhile to talk a little bit more about what we've seen from an information architecture's a good one, and its ability to increase the level of adoption in a SharePoint-based application.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always recommend a phased approach to implementing SharePoint. That's highly recommended. Don't try and boil the ocean. Don't immediately roll out SharePoint to an entire organization at once, right? The most successful SharePoint projects that I've been a part of they've always started small. Start with a single department, better yet a smaller functional group within a department, and focus on their document-centric business processes, right? So maybe build out a single document library with a simple taxonomy to get people using and really understanding the system, and once you're comfortable, try and scale it out from there. I also think it's really important to identify a SharePoint champion, right? Someone who is a SharePoint advocate or maybe a power user who really knows how to use and configure the system. You might have executive leadership support and IT support, but it's absolutely necessary to have at least one champion of SharePoint in your group or department that you're implementing SharePoint for. Organizations really need this buy-in to be successful.
Excellent. Yeah, I agree. It's adoption here again, I think is the name of the game. Simplification is an important part of it, but but I think you have to make it today even more so super simple for people to know what they're looking at and know what to do with information in their environment. We are at our time, so what I'm going to do, we have some questions. I'm going to answer a couple of these really quickly for everybody, and then we will also follow up with if we don't get to all the questions. The first question I'm going to take, it says, can you set up records management successfully in SharePoint/Teams using an E3 license only? And the answer to that question is it depends on what you think about records management. There are certainly a lot of standard use cases that are available in Office 365 today, Microsoft 365 today, in their capability around retention management is really more the name of the game out of the box with Microsoft than pure records management. So for some on the call, it might be splitting hairs, but it means something to us. So not really going to deep dive into that, but certainly from a retention perspective, retention management perspective, I think you can do some things even in an E3 license. It's limited, but there is some capability there. I'm going to give this next one to you, Will. And if that didn't answer the question, please feel free to completely follow up and we'll be happy to dive into more detail. A lot of taxonomies are hierarchical. This is the question to you, Will. Do you have a risk of brittleness from a hierarchical taxonomy? What do you think, Will?
Brittleness, maybe I'm not understanding that one, but you're exactly right. The taxonomies are hierarchical, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It does take some planning before you just start jumping in and creating taxonomy elements, right? Because there are some gotchas with SharePoint, right? If you go in and create a child off of a parent content type, you can't. It's hard to go back in and put something in between those two objects, right? So it takes a little bit of planning ahead of time before you really start using the system. So yeah, I guess that can have a risk of brittleness from that. Exactly.
Yeah. And Will and I, just a point of note, Will and I both went to Texas A&M, so we struggle with syllabic words like that, like taxonomies and hierarchical. All right, so let me see here. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Let me see if there's anything. Here's a good one at the top here. How to engage people in records management within SharePoint when it sounds like a lot of work, and do we really need to do all that? Now, that's a great question. I'll put my 2 cents in, and Will, happy to turn over to you. I think the key to this point here is we can't preach it enough, as automation and simplification. Most of the war stories of people that have had a bad experience with doing records management projects or just new content and document management systems is death by 1,000 pieces of metadata, and the complexity required of somebody to figure out how to classify a document and where to put it, and what, really making sure they know what it is. So the more simple you make that, the more likely you are to get people to buy into it. Will, any other thoughts?
Yeah, it does sound like a lot of work because usually it is a lot of work, right? It does take some planning. There is some work. There are some growing pains with adopting SharePoint, right? But whenever you show people the benefits of what you can really get out of it, you get buy-in pretty easily. And that's how I try to engage people whenever I'm on these types of projects is, look, this is how we're doing it today. Maybe you're moving from a folder structure or file shares into SharePoint. This is how you go through and try and find content today. This is how it can be in the future. Look how much better and easier it is. So I try and show the benefits up front instead of focusing on the potential amount of work that it could involve.
Okay. So I've got a couple more here, but we're a bit over time. So rather than keep everybody, because we want to keep keep it to 30 minutes and make good use of your time today, and appreciate everybody joining in. We'll send out responses to these other questions when we send out the recording to everybody. We'll have that in there, as well as you can see here, if you have any further questions or comments, you can send an email to either Will or myself. We'd be happy to hear from you. And again, in particular, it'd be great to get some feedback on this style of webinar and whether you thought it was helpful or valuable versus maybe just a standard walk through a PowerPoint deck type of webinar. So with that, I'm gonna say goodbye. Will, thank you for joining us here today. Your insights were valuable and very interesting as well. And we look forward to having you all on a webinar that we have here in the future. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too.